Hi, my name is Pat Bills. I'm the lead minister here at the Highland Oaks Church of Christ. Several months ago, our elders decided to pursue conversations about racial reconciliation, and so we formed a Bridge Builders team. And one of the things that we discovered as a team very quickly is the power of stories. So these next two people are members of our Bridge Builder team, but more importantly, they're members here at the Highland Oaks Church that represent the power of stories. I hope that you'll take some time to listen and to reflect on what my friends Don and René have to share about the power of racial reconciliation, but also the power of how this conversation is important to them, to their life, and to the life of our church.
Well, to be honest, the conversation about race reconciliation has not really been important to me until just recently. I think my experience, my life experience, is very similar to other people in my generation. I was born in 1942 and grew up in Victoria, Texas, which is a town in south central Texas. My paternal grandfather was born in Arkansas in the late 1860s, which was just a few years after the Civil War had ended. And as a result, my family was not far removed from the thoughts and attitudes of the Old South. And I could remember that there was a general sense that black people were different and inferior. In Victoria, the black people were a small minority of the population. They lived in segregated neighborhoods. They had their own schools and churches. The public schools were totally segregated. In my class, it was 90% or more Anglo. The other were Hispanic students. I didn't know any black persons except a maid that worked for my uncle and a man who placed membership at our church who became a friend of my father. In 1960, I enrolled in Abilene Christian University, at that time Christian College, and it was totally segregated also. In 1962, two graduates of Southwestern Christian College, which was then a black junior college, enrolled to complete their junior and senior years. And I knew they were there, I knew they were on campus, but I honestly don't ever remember seeing them in the 2 years that we were there together. So for me, integration was really a non-event. In the 1950s and 60s, Martin Luther King emerged as a leader in the civil rights movement. He was a controversial figure, and frankly, I recall being unhappy about the civil unrest that he created. Unfortunately, it was many years later before I really understood the magnitude, the significance of what he had done and appreciated the sacrifice that he made. Carol and I moved to Dallas after we got out of college. That was over 50 years ago. We've lived in white neighborhoods. I've worked in companies that had a few black employees, but very few. Highland Oaks has the highest percentage of black members of any church that we've attended since we've been here. So our life has continued to be segregated. And so earlier this year, at age 77, it occurred to me that I really needed to think about race. I'd never spent any time trying to understand why people were so concerned about race. I read a statement actually several years ago that stuck with me. Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's partner and friend, said, if you really don't know and can state and understand both sides of an issue, you really have an uninformed opinion. And it just occurred to me that that's where I stood. And so I realized that I needed to take the time to understand why so many people are concerned. And to be honest, I'm embarrassed and sorry that I waited so long.
Well, given the climate in our country right now, I think that we all need to figure out a way to understand each other better. Uh, Certainly, as a person of color, I know there are some disadvantages that I have faced, but I also want to better understand people who don't look like me, they weren't raised like me, and I think it's just time. And I believe we come to that place, and I believe that the church has to lead that. And I think this is the time. Well, really, I frequently think about my grandchildren. And I do that because I was raised by a grandparent, and I remember her saying, my prayers and hopes always go out in front of you. And so I have been praying, as I'm sure she prayed for me, that their lives wouldn't be as contentious as maybe mine has been. And I know mine has been better than hers. And when I see them on the playground with children who aren't their size, aren't their color, not in their neighborhood, they don't go and try to segment everybody out. They play. They just take each other at face value. They see each other's differences, but they just want to be together. And I hope that that spirit stays in them as they grow older, and I hope that our world is kinder and gentler and better because of what we're doing right now, so that those kids won't have to experience some of the things I've experienced. And so I'm sure that was my grandmother's prayer for me, and it has been better for me than it was for her. And now that's my prayer for them, and I just hope that our world is so much different when they get to be responsible adults that we don't end up having to have the talk with their children. And that's why.
So I've heard of the talk before, but I don't know if a lot of people know what that means. Would you be willing to talk about that too, or is that a little too personal?
It's not too personal. Usually, I used to think it was just boys, around the age of 11 or 12. And for some people, even before that. I think sometimes it depends on which neighborhood you live in. You sit your children down and you tell them, if you are stopped, make sure your hands are on the steering wheel. Make sure you say yes, sir, and no, sir. Be sure not to make any quick moves. Don't wear a hoodie on your head. You're inviting trouble. There's several elements of the talk, but I think that's basic elements of the talk. And I personally didn't have the talk given to me, but my brothers did. But now I would say that parents probably say it to their daughters as well. It's real. I've always worked in highly professional environments with people who were all white collar. And I can remember having a manager who was a CFO, and we were having a conversation one day about golf courses. And I was like, oh, that's just wasted property. That's what I said to him. And he said, you should be glad it's not a cotton field. That was so poignant to me and so stringent. That probably happened to me 22 years ago, and I still remember it just like it was today. And he continued to be my boss. I continued to be a good worker, but I saw him very differently after that. And so I'm hoping that my grandchildren don't have a boss like that would even say that, or that would even think that. And so I think part of understanding each other better prevents those kinds of things. And I hope we can dispel the myth that people want something for free, or that we want people to feel guilty for what someone else has done. That's not the case. The case is, see me for who I am, love me for who I am, and allow me to do the same with you. And I'm hoping that's where we'll get with the things that we're doing.
Well, it was in the late 1990s that I was involved with ACU, and we were interested in trying to increase the involvement of people in color on our campus. We wanted more students, we wanted more faculty, we wanted more administrators. So that we decided that we would get in touch with some black ministers, leading black ministers, and some administrators from Southwestern Christian College, just to see if they could give us some ideas about the best way to do that. So the group came together, and there were about 30 people in this group, and we were ready to begin the discussion, and it immediately became evident that there was a problem that we had to talk about first. And so one of the highly respected older black ministers told a story about how he was rejected as a student at Abilene Christian College on the basis of race. And he talked about the deep hurt and pain that had resulted in his life as a result of that. And then several other black ministers spoke up, and they had endured that same experience and were again, really hurt by what had happened. I really was emotionally touched by the pain and the hurt that was expressed by these wonderful men. For the first time in my life, I personally heard and saw the impact of injustice on the lives of black people. It was obvious that the first step for ACU was to offer an individual apology to our brothers, or institutional apology to our brothers and sisters in Christ, but ask for their forgiveness. So in November of 1999, Royce Bunny, president of ACU, spoke to a full auditorium at the Southwestern Christian College lectureships. He said, in part, "We are here today to confess the sins of racism and discrimination and to issue a formal apology to all of you and to ask for your forgiveness." The apology was graciously received and acknowledged with a prolonged standing ovation. In the years since that experience, I have been much more intentional about developing relationships with the black people who came into my life. But because we've lived a largely segregated life, I don't really have that many black friends. This year, for the first time in my life, I have a strong desire to learn more about why we are having racial problems. For the first time in my life, I'm taking the time to read and to listen and to seek to understand the root causes of racial tensions in our country. To be honest, as I read and as I listen, sometimes I'm really uncomfortable. And sometimes I disagree with what I'm reading. But it's so important, I think, to be informed and to really understand, whether I agree or not, how people feel about this. Well, you know, it just seems right that Christians in this country should be leading the conversation about racial reconciliation. Jesus, through example and word, taught that his followers should reach out to the people who are marginalized by society. He was criticized for associating with sinners. And when he was asked about who's a good neighbor, he told a story about a Samaritan who was the good neighbor. I think if he was here today, he would be involved in this conversation. Unfortunately, the religious leaders of his day never listened and in fact hated him because he kept pointing out their flaws. And I just wonder what he would say to us today. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught that if you go to the altar and remember that some people are unhappy with you, or they have problems with you, lay your gift at the altar and go and be reconciled. And then come back and offer your gift. I'd hope that we would reach out to our brothers and sisters in Christ and to do our part to be reconciled to them. I've thought often about what I would love to see happen. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote something about that. And, you know, it's often said that Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week. I hope that one day Highland Oaks is composed of people of all colors with no majority or minority group. I hope that one day Highland Oaks will be a church with people of every socioeconomic level, including rich and homeless. I hope that one day Highland Oaks will be a place where the membership is leadership is equally diverse with elders and ministers from every race and economic circumstances. And wouldn't it be wonderful to enjoy the same diversity in the church today as we will experience in heaven? I just think God would be pleased with that.
And so my hope for Highland Oaks, after going through this entire process of trying to understand racial situations, is that each one of us that has gone through a small group will then tell someone else, encourage someone else, challenge someone else, and exponentially reach thousands of people, because we want everybody to be better, not just ourselves.